everyone. Welcome back to the last afternoon of EXAG for this year. As I get some feedback through my laptop, apologies about that. Anyway, let's get started.
Okay. Hey everyone, my name is Sasha Zad and my advisor of correspondence, and I'll be talking to you about addressing the elephant in the room, virtual characters with opinions, or opinionated virtual characters. So, humans are really complex creatures, and their conversations more so. And in order to have believable virtual characters, I feel that we need to support more meaningful, more dramatic experiences with better conversations, both amongst virtual characters with one another as well as virtual characters with humans. And so, therefore, these conversations should support concepts like agreement or disagreement, alliance or criticism of views and opinions. And so, these could actually tell you what characters do in a game and actually kind of drive these experiences. So in the past today, we've seen a variety of work that has looked at conversation as well as the way knowledge is informed and spread between characters, as well as informed to the humans and the players that are involved. And we've seen systems like Versu or SAD that have actually done a really great job at this. And what I intend to do with my work is to see how do virtual characters actually have arguments with one another? How do they hold strong opinions on various topics that might be conflicting? How do they offer facts and refute each other's arguments and evidence? And how could they then use those arguments to actually form groups that actually believe in the same concepts and therefore have social rules or guidelines that they could follow? And so towards that end, I'm working on a system that has opinion dynamics along with a social simulation that goes with it. So opinion dynamics is important for characters to discuss or exchange their views and opinions with one another and behave with one another in what is acceptable social scenarios and practices. And so group dynamics and the way people form opinions and change alliances has been studied for a really long time, both by social scientists, historians, psychologists, and so on. And if you actually think about it and you look at the news any day and open up a computer, you actually see how these groups of opinions are kind of categorized together. So you might have people who are grouped by region, where you say the Scottish voted overwhelmingly to remain in the referendum, or by occupation with tech executives, or by political ideology that the humans might follow. So for instance, Democrats discussing immigration reform, or maybe even just by interest and other attributes that you might give your virtual characters or the humans. So for instance, in this case, the 10 spookiest episodes of Whovians to watch this Halloween. So the way that individuals relate to a group and join and change their alliance with these groups is something that is really complex and needs to be studied in greater detail, and it's something that we don't really map as much in the narrative intelligence community. And so what I'm interested in doing is, once we have these groups that are formed, how do they shift between the groups? How do you know that once these groups are formed, taking actions that fall within the group's purview or interests are good for the characters, or otherwise make them feel maybe alienated by a group if they have intentions or actions that go against the group values? As well as how could the characters belonging to these groups then subscribe to additional sources of information that would either inform their bias or otherwise? And finally, how could we then use this information to form meaningful connections and relationships between these virtual characters and group members? And so the goal for the opinion dynamics part of the project was to have a model of discussion that can support a broad variety of topics on various issues, would account for inherent bias that the characters might have, already how they feel about certain issues and topics, account for bias in the information that's been provided to the characters in the first place, allow the characters to argue as well as influence one another on various topics and subject matters, and finally allow these views to then influence the social relationships between these characters. So prior work actually fails to model the ever-changing complex social relationships that characters have. So one of the things that we do differently from the social scientists and the psychologists that we've taken some of these theories from and applied is that a lot of these theories are actually algorithms where they have a grid-like structure. Every NPC is connected to maybe the 8 NPCs around them. They keep discussing the same topic, therefore changing their relationship and eventually modifying the opinions, and eventually reach some kind of consensus. But what these theorems fail to account for is something that the narrative intelligence community does really well, which is that NPCs can actually be free to move around and change the way that they change the people that they talk to. So, for instance, if you keep joining a group or a party where you disagree with everything that everyone says, chances are you're less likely to go back there if you don't like what people in the room. And so, how does that then change the decisions that you make with respect to your actions? Additionally, we want to account for a variety of topics because, again, to model humans, you might agree with some NPCs on certain topics, but vehemently disagree on other topics. And so, is there a way for us to look at weighted priorities of which subjects matter most to the NPCs and therefore change the relationship as well as the aggregate bias according to the same? And finally, we wanted to be, well, not finally, almost finally, we wanted to be able to add new concepts and issues that could be inserted into the knowledge base over time and allow for the model to keep accounting for those. And then to subscribe or unsubscribe from sources of information based on your current views about that topic. And so all these changes from the previous work led us to then forming our social simulation model. And so the goals for our social simulation model were, how do we have characters actually walk around a virtual environment talking to each other? How could we account for these discussions, having these biases that we spoke about during the discussion phase? How do we then use this discussion model no matter what simulation is happening? So it could be actually used by other research groups as well as our own. And finally, how do we allow for ad hoc groups forming over time that have similar views? So towards this end, we first started by creating a model of knowledge that we thought would support a broad variety of topics. So we have 4 things in the model of knowledge that I'll be walking you through. So first you have the rating. So the rating is the evaluation of the information or the judgment that the NPC has about the information. It could also be a measure of impartiality of the information. So it could be media bias, it could be IMDb ratings for the movie, it could be reviews that you're getting for the paper, and so on. You have topics of information. So these topics are a clustering of information regarding a specific field or a subject. A single topic might have one or more objects of discussion, which we come to, but those objects could belong to multiple topics at the same time. So for instance, the PCG work that's been done in this conference could belong to artificial intelligence, but could also belong to, say, game design. Finally, we have the object of discussion. So objects of discussion are single units of information. So the NPCs, when they discuss or have conversations with one another, they look for topics that they have in common. They choose a specific object of discussion that they want to discuss further in detail, and then they argue about their views about these topics. So for new information in our model, every NPC will note the original rating or bias of the information that's been provided to it. It will then associate that with their own view based on their history or other conversations that they might have on the subject. And then we have sources. Sources are basically a way for us to create new information about various objects that are being discussed in the simulation. Sources itself might have a rating that's associated with them. So for instance, AAAI, how good is it as a journal, how good is it as a conference, or Rotten Tomatoes, how reliable are their ratings, and so on. So the way that we modeled our knowledge base, we found that we could actually discuss a wide variety of topics. So for instance, political issues where the objects of discussion become individual news articles. The sources could be online or print media, and the rating could be bias and affiliation. I've already walked through approximately just some of the examples, the games and say the movie genres, but there's one more really interesting one that we came across, which was you could actually take the same topic and discuss 2 different aspects of it with this knowledge model that we created. So for instance, with this one, you're still talking about, in the first 2 rows, you're still talking about political issues, but in one, you're discussing individual news articles, and in the other, you're discussing the political candidates. And so, based on what you're discussing, the sources of information that you choose will vary from, say, candidate rallies and interviews to the media sources that you're getting, and the ratings will vary from, say, the political bias associated with the news to, say, the approval ratings of the candidate. So the knowledge model can be actually used for a wide variety of discussion. Next, we look at how we model the views of a character as well. So to actually look at how character views change, we draw from previous work from Weinenthal and Ash, who have worked on how bias and opinions change with different virtual AI agents over time. So we define bias as the agent's predisposition to adopt a particular viewpoint. So bias is generally informed by a wide variety of things, and in our simulation, it's informed in three different ways. One are the views that an NPC may inherit from their parents, or inherit because they're culturally located in a region where an overwhelming group of people agree or believe in those certain rules. It could be that the NPC over time, so instead of this nature approach has a nurture, a nurture approach has a nature approach, but over time the NPCs had multiple discussions and is able to have their own specific views on a topic because they feel they're knowledgeable enough about it. Or it could of course be the initial bias that they learn when the topic is introduced to them. So if there's a topic that I know nothing about and a group of people come up to me and give me some information, at the moment until I verify the information or look at my own sources, I might actually accept approximately the mean of the group that is told me this information. You also have the attitude of the agent. So the attitude is the agent's private views on a particular topic. It represents your internal evaluation of a topic. The private is important because the agent might not always express publicly their attitude. So an attitude is an internal evaluation, and opinion is what you express of that internal evaluation. There are times when an agent might choose not to express their views. For instance, you can imagine a situation where you're in a work environment and you disagree with all your colleagues, but you don't want to openly say so for fear of being punished or so on. And so this can be different from the attitude. There's also the uncertainty involved in your views. So the uncertainty is the measure of the agent's confidence in their own views. The higher the uncertainty, the more likely you are to change your views or accept other perspectives. Uncertainty could be from, again, a large amount of ways that the agent can come across as uncertain. For instance, if the information in the knowledge base that they currently have inadequately backs the claim, so they don't have enough information to actually make an informed decision about the subject, or if a large variety of contradictory opinions have been presented to the agent and they're now more uncertain about their views, or even if an agent is surrounded by a large amount of agents who are very confident about their views and their views differ from the agents. Next, we have the public compliance threshold. So the public compliance threshold is basically when we calculate the strength of the public opinion in the discussion that the agent is in. If the public opinion strength exceeds a certain value, then the agent will give in to this peer pressure and kind of go with the public opinion. And so it allows for the agent to feel more accepted within a community. And finally, we have the private compliance threshold. So when the view or when the strength of the public opinion is below this value, then the agent might choose to remain silent about their views or stand by their own views but not actually change anything. We've also given in our simulation experts on particular topics. So we have schools and businesses where certain individuals, depending on the school or the business, might be experts in their field of discourse. And so then they would have a much higher private compliance threshold. And so because they're more certain about their views as well. Next, I'll be walking you through how conversations occur with our dynamic opinion mapping. So initially, we assign a starting cultural bias to the population that we have. So this could be based on any attribute. I'll be walking you through a case study, but for now, you could think of it as anything from how do people feel about various other people, about social rules, about gun control, about whatever. Children that are, procedurally generated, inherit a mean of their parents' views, but the way that my simulation works is they tend to agree a little more or a little less with parents on various issues, because you might not always be exactly in the mean of certain ones. These attitudes can of course change over time through conversations with other agents, We cluster all these expressed opinions from the participants that are in this conversation. Once we cluster these opinions, we check whether we've reached public consensus. We say that we've reached public consensus if there are only a few groups of a large number of people who have very decided views on the topic. Then once that is done, we look for presence of normative social influence, or which is peer pressure, which I'll be walking you through. And once we have this information, then we realign the characters' views to where they fall in this conversation and how their opinions are going to be modeled after this. The number of groups is something in the cluster that we find based on the mean square error for each of the groups based on the views that they express or their opinions on the topic. So if the public consensus is formed, then let's start breaking up the agents. So if an agent has high uncertainty, then they're more likely to defer to the public opinion. So if there is a consensus that's formed, then we realign the views of the agent to the largest opinion group that there is, to the mean of the largest opinion group that there is, and then we realign their attitude to match their opinion. If there's an agent with low uncertainty, first we find the opinion group that is closest to the opinion of the agent itself. Once we found the opinion group, we calculate the opinion strength. The opinion strength depends on various factors. I have the math in the paper, so I will leave you to read it, but I'll just walk you through what they are. So it depends on the public opinion group's size. So a lot of people disagreeing with you gives you a slightly more strength in the public opinion. The homogeneity of the groups of the opinions in the group itself will contribute to the fact that they've reached consensus. The discrepancies in the agent's own internal opinions and attitudes. So is the agent only saying something to fit in, or do they internally also, are they accurately reflecting what they feel their attitude is as well? And finally, the uncertainty in the agent's own views about what their opinions are. Once we found the public strength, we look at where the strength lies. So for public opinions that have low opinion strengths, the agent does not change their mind. The agent decides that it's not worth it, my views are kind of my own, and I feel like I'm right, and they stay where they are. If you have a moderate strength, though, you see kind of two interesting things that happen from the social science work that we read up on. One is if the opinion strength is relatively moderate in strength and the agent has low uncertainty, the agents actually change their views to the opinion group that matches theirs most closely, not the largest group necessarily. But they believe that the change in their views are a natural and expected evolution. So they don't feel like they're giving in to peer pressure. They don't feel like they're actually being forced to change their views. They feel like, as part of the conversation, yes, I can accept these changes, and so I'm going to believe this thing. If they have a moderate opinion strength, but they have a high uncertainty, then the agents, again, will conform to the group that matches most closely to theirs. However, in this case, the agents will concede the conversation, admit that they have made a mistake, and then realign their views to match the group where the opinion strength is the closest to theirs. So in this case, the agent actually understands that it is giving in to peer pressure. And finally, if you have a high opinion strength, in a really interesting scenario, agents actually understand that this is a lot of peer pressure, and then they may realign their opinion. So they might decide to either say what it is that the group is saying, or keep silent, or not actually change their internal attitude. So while they might outwardly express something to make them fit in with the group, inwardly they know that they're not going to change their mind. And then their uncertainty in the information may or may not increase based on the difference in the opinion. So this is something that you could actually see if you're sitting as a sports fan. I'm not a sports person, so I'm going to go with the Quidditch example. If you were a Slytherin sitting with a bunch of Gryffindors, even though there is a high opinion strength, you're really unlikely to change your affiliation and switch to another team. So you realize there's peer pressure, you realize if you cheer too loudly for your team, you're going to get stuff thrown at you, but while you might not express your opinion, you will not change your internal attitude. Finally, if there's no public consensus that's been formed, then the agent finds the cluster of opinions most similar to that of themselves, and then they realign their opinions and attitudes to the mean of that particular cluster, whether or not it's the largest cluster, whether or not it has a strong opinion strength or anything. Once this is done, our simulation adds in the ability for the agent to realign their general attitudes about a topic. So a topic consists of many objects of discussion as we've covered so far. So you look at a weighted mean of all the topics and that tells you your overall attitude about the subject at hand. It also lets the agent at this point subscribe to new sources of information or unsubscribe from old ones based on the media bias or the rating of the information that it has at the moment, and updates the relationships and so on accordingly. So for the case study, we actually looked at political ideology and we looked at US political news. So to explain why we went with this as a case study, we were searching for a data set and we considered things like procon.org, IMDb, ratings of various conference papers and so on. And we realized that in order to have a rated set with bias of the media that is being provided, well, I would have to then adjust and worry about my own bias in the information itself because I would be rating a lot of that information. And so we decided to go with allsides.com. I'll be talking about that in a bit. Additionally, this is kind of the age of political discourse, given various situations and circumstances that are happening in this country. And this is actually a line from a commentary that was written by Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founding fathers. And he said this after he watched Thomas Jefferson and John Adams engage the country in a very divisive political battle for the presidential election. And he was hoping that eventually there would be a way to angrily debate the most contentious ideas without ripping the nation apart. And so that kind of gave us the additional motivation to choose political topics as our case study. So if you remember this discussion data set, we'll actually be looking at the first one, which is various issues such as immigration, gun control, health, and so on. We'll be looking at individual news articles from various media sources which have a political bias, rating, or affiliation. So we're using the all sides data set. I don't know if anyone actually follows their website, but they take all the news from the day and then they kind of they have a bias rating that occurs based on a wide variety of other sources, where it looks at every article based on the bias of the source itself, as well as bias of individual editorials and opinion articles that are written. So we already have data that's been tagged. So here's some example of the all sides data set. So this is some of the news sources that they have, and this is their bias rating. So their bias rating is a combination of blind bias surveys, editorial reviews, third-party research, and so on. We selected a wide variety of topics and articles, such as civil rights, immigration, healthcare, and so on. We took an equal number of articles from every issue. We looked at the media bias and the bias of the article itself. And we let the NPCs talk about their attitude about various topics based on a weighted distribution of how important or how prioritized their topics were to them, as well as their overall political affiliations that they went with. Our town is a small American town. It has a few businesses, it has some schools and some civic or community buildings and regions. These areas are basically places where the NPCs can gather, congregate, and discuss various issues. Here's an example of sample discussion from our town. So the object of discussion was the news article, room for debate, should birthright citizenship be abolished? The source of the article was New York Times, which has a bias rating of leaning left. The discussion occurred at work with colleagues. The topic itself the news article fell under immigration. The duration was 11 minutes. 11 minutes means the algorithm ran 11 times, which means that's how many times the NPCs had to actually change their mind and realign their views. And there were 4 people in the discussion. This is a little more annoying to look at, but I'm going to try to walk you through it. Every bias or opinion goes from -1 on the left to a right bias, which is 1. And you can see for every NPC their old views and then their new views to see if they changed after the conversation. And I think I got the next one. Okay, so Ruth and Suzanne basically learn about the article first time. So they choose to accept the views that the other NPCs have put forward to them. Richard, whose political views actually lean left at -0.5 before the discussion, is more convinced about his views after reading the article. As such, his uncertainty on the subject reduces. Vicky actually changes her views. She was originally politically aligned right, before the discussion, but after the discussion, she finds herself a little more uncertain about her views. Overall, their political affiliations do not change because, of course, it's just a single discussion, but hopefully more discussions of this kind would help them better inform the views that they have. So for future work, currently we've done opinion modeling, we've got discussions well meshed out. We have it integrated with a simple social scenario. In the future, I'm hoping to be able to allow for more complex social relationships to form, and would like to add emotions and expressions on how discussions are handled. Additionally, I'm really interested in how location could actually change the way that the characters interact with each other. So could you simulate cultural preferences or regional preferences? So for instance, maybe NPCs from Japan with strict gun control laws would not choose to buy a gun when they're robbing a bank, but something else. And robbing a bank being, the narrative intelligence scenario. But yeah. Stronger opinions amongst members who are more directly associated with an issue. So if an issue happens in the city or the town that you were generated in, maybe you have much stronger opinions on the subject than someone who's discussing it from miles away. Modeling of an exchange of cultural knowledge would be really great. And finally, to look at the expressiveness and expressivity in terms of diversity and preferences. Finally, in terms of actions and events, it would be nice if we could look at group formation to see how these groups form ad hoc on various basis, and then how could they unlock a class of actions that NPCs don't already have. So a group of students with the same opinion could then unlock an action, petition the school to reduce your carbon footprint, and then take decisions on the basis of these opinions. And that's about it. Thanks. Questions?
So if you think about making a game out of this, what kinds of gameplay can you imagine? I mean, I can imagine that it'd be fun to just kind of poke the system in different ways, but have you thought about like how this, what kind of interventions the player could have, and how you would deal with sort of issues of surfacing, like there's a tremendous amount of internal state in this simulation, and the player wouldn't be able to assimilate all of it. So how would you think about doing stuff
So
like that?
some of the things that I've thought about would be if you actually had a player in a group discussion with a bunch of other people, and the player is given access to a list of facts and information that they know, and they can first internally rank their own fact, like how they feel about various issues that they want to discuss. And then based on how the conversation is going, maybe the player could offer various NPCs, hey, have you thought about this particular perspective, to see how they actually attempt to change the conversation or change the views of the characters, or whether the player themselves maybe change their mind over time. Additionally, again, as I said earlier, like, I'm actually really interested in how once you involve location-based interactions, how it could actually unlock a new series of interactions for the virtual characters in any interactive narrative. So rather than characters being authored to have goals, maybe they form goals based on their opinions on certain matters because they want to change something. And I think if you could actually map when their minds change or when they disagree with someone and tie that in with emotions or feedback for the user, it might make for really interesting cultural rules, games or simulations and so on, training scenarios. Okay.
Really fascinating work. Thank you for bringing us here. I'm super excited. So you're talking about like simulating this at the level of like a whole community of people, which is really interesting. So I'm just curious if you can speak more about what the sort of like longer term intentions are for having it be at that level rather than just like one conversation.
So this is actually kind of fun because it ties into my DC talk Friday. But I'm actually really interested in how narratives work in real world scenarios and real world spaces, and how as a player in augmented reality you can kind of walk around and talk to different people who are in different places or interact with them and find emergent gameplay in those scenarios. And I feel like if you want to converse with NPCs, and I can't always script exact dialogues for like every place on this planet that someone decides to test the game out in. And this is kind of an interesting way where you have maybe a knowledge base or sources of information that could be updated every now and then NPCs could take these sources of information, learn from the humans itself, talk to each other, and maybe you could see how that spreads through the community, the news and information.
So maybe I missed it, but have you thought about, or what do you think about sort of meta reasoning? So the individual NPCs might change their opinion, but also the groups, right? The Whovians might have a schism over some particular change in the canon, or so on and so forth.
Right, so that's actually what I mean by it's kind of interesting that way because, for instance, just with the Whovian example, everyone was really worried about Jodie Whittaker becoming the Doctor. But so within the community, if you look at simulation, you could probably see something like they were really worried and they weren't completely positive about it. But then once the episodes came out, the news sources that they all subscribe to, which are Whovian interest news sources, would give them a giant amount of articles on how well these episodes are going, as well as other NPCs might say, oh, I really like this particular one, which eventually kind of propagates through the society in time. Which is why I was interested in having news sources that they could subscribe to or unsubscribe from.
Right. And a follow-up very briefly. So with respect to that specific example, a lot of the reason that people are upset was kind of troubling, like under the hood. Is that surface to the, not to the players, but like to, can you look at it and be like, this is why these people have these opinions?
So in the program that I have right now, you can if you actually look at the code, but I haven't gotten a UI out there for users to look at exactly yet. I'm going to have to work on that in the future, but for now, yeah, you could actually see the trend of why people change their mind. So that one discussion was like an example of how you could actually see people change their mind after a certain number of iterations of the algorithm.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Very cool. I wanted to ask you about why you made the decision to go with like real world modern day issues in terms of the simulation. I can imagine a number of sort of pitfalls that you could run in there that like more sort of fictional or other approaches may not.
Honestly, one of the reasons that I was okay with even trying out the political news data set is because I thought the EXAG community was probably one of the few places that would be a nice, comfortable place to try. But I did really consider maybe doing IMDb movies or so on, where you have like genres that you can classify it on. Again, the problem with choosing any specific area for them to converse on is that I have to have a curated data set from that area that doesn't actually include my own bias in the information. I tried to not include my own bias in the information. For instance, if I did Doctor Who episodes, well, my NPCs would all be really excellent Doctor Who fans, but everyone else might be really bored. And so I think it depends on the data set. So the way I see it is you could technically use the conversation model for any game that is being created in this community, hopefully. So for instance, you could use it in, a prom week, where you're discussing how much you like a particular character or not, and so the characters could be discussing attributes of a particular person in this case and their popularity index with other NPCs, or you could use it with any other conversation that might be there.
I have another sort of response to that, which is, I was also nervous, and it was Sasha's idea to use this, and I was also a little bit nervous about it, but I actually think that it's a good decision because it means that if there is anything kind of problematic in the model, that will surface in a very visible way, right? And I think that it's a good way to kind of perhaps catch some of those issues where you wouldn't necessarily if they were just expressing opinions about politics versus matters or whatever.
Yeah, so that's another thing. So my original set didn't actually have political issues, so it just had topics A, B, C, D, E, and then random numbers generated according to the views of the characters, and then I didn't feel attached to that data set at all because it felt I didn't actually know what was happening. I couldn't tell whether the views were shifting in like a meaningful manner. So I was looking for a data set that was a little more meaningful to understand and would be more relatable to the people who would be looking at it. Yeah.
I did notice we didn't see a lot of the data set, but it had some like left-right labels that I wouldn't.
Oh,
like
I agree
ABC.
completely. Oh, I agree completely. So
ABC News being on the left is weird.
I agree. Was it ABC News on that?
Not that that's your fault in any way.
It's here.
There you go.
Say
Yeah.
it from
So lean left. So again, so this is something which All Sides has, and
Right.
their own website says that it's a combination of blind bias surveys, editorial reviews, third-party research, independent research, community reviews, and so on. The community reviews themselves don't necessarily change the rating, but it does act as like a trigger so that they know that there's something wrong because enough people disagree with it. So by all means, please go tell them that it doesn't make sense on the left. But it's also the overall views of the news source, and that's separate from the views of the article. So it could be that ABC news source might not necessarily lean left, but that particular article was rated to lean left because of the perspective that it had. Maybe it was an editorial article. So there's a lot of touchy. It's a really great API to pull and use. Yeah, it's one of the better bias rankings that I found out there. So, any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I really like that you're using political data. I think it's like compelling and interesting, and I want to chat with you about it. I'm particularly curious because like you said that you don't want your own bias to leach into this thing, right? But and Ian's question is alluding to this as well, right? Like all data sets are biased in some way.
Yeah.
Were there any moments when you were working on your project where you felt like it was giving you insight into bias inherent in this data set?
Oh my gosh, so many times. So many times. It wasn't just this data set, it was even my own bias that I kept reevaluating because I was trying to figure out what examples to put into the paper, and I was like, if I put this one, that just shows my bias so strongly. And I was like, I really want to give the example of Japan and gun control. So, okay, fine, I'm going to go with it. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I actually spoke to the people, the founders of the website. They were really, really nice and helpful and gave me a bunch of ideas for it. But they said that they periodically have to reevaluate the bias of even the people who work for the company through a large variety of sources because they want to make sure that the data out there is as clean and unbiased as they can. They also have like sections on the side that tell you how to actually conduct political discourse in like a friendly, safe environment and a bunch of other things. They do talks and so on. So you definitely see their bias speak out as well. You definitely see
there's bias even in the name of that data set.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, so they actually do kind of interesting things though, just from this is an aside and I probably should end the talk soon, but they keep switching the order in which the articles are shown on the website. For every topic they have a list of like 100 different articles. They change which order they give you the papers in, what sources you subscribe to, everything, so you really get to see every issue from all sides, which is kind of fun. I think that's it. Cool. Don't touch you, who's next?
Does anyone have a USB-C to HDMI or VGA?
I have USB-C to VGA.
Yeah, that would be great. Right.
So up next is the deceptive level generator paper.
Okay.
Who is presenting the deceptive level generator paper? I don't want to call people out by name, but I can if necessary. Deception. Clearly.
Maybe there was no level generator.
I mean, that's how deceptive goes. Gets to leave
Maybe they went to the wrong room.
Can someone check the other room to see if somebody people in the wrong place?
What am I looking for? Okay,
Adil, Hassan, Mirza, or Sajid?
Yeah. So, while
Someone are running upstairs to check there as well.
okay,
There's no
well,
one in the
we'll just reorder things for now because we do have a third talk this session. So, up next is wonderful design applying appraisal theory to procedural level generation. And then we'll have the deceptive level generation paper afterwards.
So thank you all for being here. This is going to be pretty exciting because this is my very first talk on my very first paper on my very first research conference. My name is Rosa Korstjens. With me here is Anders Bauer. And our other two co-authors are Joris Dormans and Riemer van Rosen. Together we wrote Wonderful Design, Applying Appraisal Theory to Procedural Level Generation. And in this work, we attempt to direct procedural level generation in a way that you can affect emotions in the player. So that's what I'll be talking about today. First, very briefly, our agenda. I'm going to start off with the context, the problem, and the research question. I'll be going a bit more in-depth on theories of emotion, because that's an important basis of our work. And then how we can affect emotions using appraisal theory, and how we use design patterns to, in generative grammars to actually generate some first results. And then finally, the discussion and conclusions. So the context of this work, it's part of Project Life Game Design. And Project Life Game Design attempts to combine expertise from software engineering with game design, so that we, with the goal to create intelligent tools for game designers, especially tools that allow them to prototype and adapt really quickly. So this is run by the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, where we both work, and also collaborating are CWI and TU Delft and 12 Dutch game companies. One of those game companies is Ludomotion, and they're currently working on the sequel to Explore. Ludomotion is the game company by Joris Dormans, one of our co-authors. And in this game, we're trying to generate a procedural world that can offer a really rich experience. And for that, we wanted to be able to guide and create emotional moments. So the problem we noticed when starting working on this was that there is a lack of abstractions and tools that enable directing a level generation, and for us specifically affecting emotions. So that led to two research questions. On one hand, how can theories of emotion be used to create design patterns that affect emotions? And we wanted to use design patterns since they can capture knowledge on both the theories of emotion and design knowledge, game design knowledge. And then the other research question, how can these being the design patterns then implemented using generative grammars for procedural level generation? So first I want to talk a bit more about theories of emotion, because emotions are way too complicated and we still don't understand everything about them, if we understand anything at all. But we have a bit of basis. There are multiple theories, dimensional and categorical being two of them, and maybe some of you will know categorical theories from Ekman. And both of these are really interested in the resulting emotion and what that means and how they relate to one each other. But the problem with that is that we want to affect the emotions. So it's really important to understand how emotions arise. And that's where appraisal theory comes in. Appraisal theory states that multiple appraisals lead to an emotion. And an appraisal is a judgment that you make in regard to your relationship with the environment. So another person will probably make a different appraisal, leading to a different emotion. So you can imagine that there are lots of different appraisals that you can make, and we need a way to talk about them. So Ellsworth and Scheer, among others, defined criteria or dimensions in which we classify those appraisals. And each appraisal is appraised, judged with a certain value, and such a set of values leads to an emotion. That's the theory. So to give a few examples, novelty. Novelty simply means that something changed, it attracts the attention, and certain emotions require high novelty to be triggered, such as joy, anger, and fear, meaning that there are more outwards emotions. Sadness doesn't, for example. And another appraisal is urgency. And urgency is how important the needs are that are currently involved in the event, and how important it is to fulfill those right now. So when you're really angry or when you're in fear, you have the need to resolve that conflict in yourself. And joy and sadness do not require such urgency. So that was in an overview of appraisal theory, and that led to the theoretical basis of our pattern language. We choose to use a pattern language because it can capture design knowledge and also the knowledge that we have on appraisal theory. So we started with pattern extraction because when we were starting with this research, we were really searching how do these patterns look like, what should they contain. So we looked at theater, we looked at action adventure games and other examples to just gain an understanding of what could be good candidates for affecting appraisals and emotional moments. And then with a set of candidates, we started on formulating our patterns and our pattern language. That meant grouping similar IDs to look for recurring patterns, and formulating them in a more abstract manner so that they could be applied in a lot of different situations. And the different fields that are involved in each pattern are also more formulated in this stage. So each pattern has a problem and a solution, different forces that influence how the implementation of the pattern works. It has a context, it has participants, so other objects that are involved in applying the pattern. and a bit more later on the patterns soon. Now, actually. This is an overview of our appraisal patterns. We have two types of patterns in our language. We have appraisal patterns and we have emotion patterns. So first, briefly on appraisal patterns. This is an overview of all the patterns currently included in our language. And to zoom in a bit, the little blocks are patterns on themselves, and the bigger blocks group them in pattern families. And each pattern, when you apply it on its own, it triggers the appraisals that are listed in the pattern. So each appraisal pattern triggers one or more appraisals, and when you apply it, depending on the forces and how you use that, those will be triggered. But you can also combine them through their relationships. That's my little bridge to the emotion patterns, because as appraisal theory states, emotion patterns are simply multiple appraisals triggered together. So our emotion patterns state as a problem, I want to trigger this emotion, and as a solution, they have a diagram much like this one, and it says that wonder requires novelty, pleasantness, and the absence of urgency. So what patterns can you then use to apply that pattern? And due to the relationships between the appraisal patterns, you can, for example, use centering and rewarding resources or appearance of objects and symmetry together to create a moment of wonder. Then we had to think of how we could implement our patterns, because we wanted to generate levels, or at least create a proof of concept that this was actually possible. So we used generative grammars for this, and generative grammars were actually really nice for this because you have to be really concrete, and when the design patterns were correctly formulated and you had enough design knowledge about the game, you could almost translate them to the rewrite rules required for the grammars. So briefly on our pattern implementation, it's important to know that we use two different grammars. We have a graph grammar and a tall grammar. And the graph grammar allows you to define relationships between different parts of the level, and in that way we create a mission structure. The tall grammar is then used to create the actual layout of the level and place objects, etc. So the first step is to define the patterns and the relationships you want to apply in the graph. And the graph is perfectly suited for this because the patterns also have relationships and a specific order in which they should be applied, so that they can actually work together. So it's probably too small, but I will tell you, these are purple nodes, and the purple nodes are a pattern. The blue arrows indicate the order and the relationships between the patterns, and the yellow node is a participant, so the object to be used in this application. So first you create rewrite rules for this, and then in the tall map you can actually structure and position the patterns, and this is also where you can allow for variances on the same pattern depending on the game, of course. And then finally, in multiple steps, you rewrite everything to terminal symbols so that it actually looks like a level. To give a bit more information about how the generation system is actually working, I have a little clip, and I'll talk over it. First, very briefly, a bit of context. This is Ludoscope. It's a tool created by Joris Gormans. We use it for level generation with generative grammars. And this window you see here is called the register form, and registers is your way of providing input to the system. So one of the inputs that's listed is requests, and it lists scrying and wonder. So it will use, it will apply the wonder pattern and attempt to use the scrying point, which is placeholder part, by the way, which you will see soon. So here's the clip. No, that's not the clip. sorry, we're gonna do it like this. So those were the registers, and then the first step, the general structure of the level is laid out. Then we translate that to a graph so we can work out the mission structure. And in the upcoming modules, we place the patterns. So this is a possible combination for Wonder. The absence of urgency, frame, resources, and focus. So this inside the frame. Then the tall map that you just saw in the first steps is enlarged to actually represent the level. And we translate the graph to a recipe, which is shown here. We'll briefly pause it. So each node that was listed in the graph is simply directly translated to a rewrite rule. So then you can execute them one by one. And when I reset it and iterate, so the absence of urgency, everything is marked with no urgency, so no spawn locations will be spawned. That was a bit quick. Then a frame is placed. Sorry. This. So a frame is placed, resources are placed on the frame, rewarding resources creating pleasantness, and then the center tile is marked to place the participant later on. So the frame is used to actually center somewhere. Here you see that just a few variations already allow for multiple solutions. The next step, the participant is placed, which you see here. We use probabilities to ensure that it's actually placed where we want it to be. And then in multiple steps, everything is rewritten to its terminal symbols. We use multiple layers to add a little bit more detail to the levels. And then here's the combined result. I'm briefly showing it in Unity, the game engine we're using, and here it is. So a frame is required to actually center somewhere, so it has a required relation. Centering creates novelty, and the rewarding resources create pleasantness. The absence of urgency in our game is realized by not placing any spawn locations nearby. So we'll quickly switch back. Is it working? Nice. So it's I'm missing a slide. All right. I'm missing a slide, so I will improvise a bit. All right. I didn't anticipate this. Yeah, it was the limitation slides.
It's great.
Lots of limitations. So we noticed limitations with the implementations themselves. It was really hard to re-recognize shapes whenever they were placed, because grammars state that you should be really specific. And so when you have a circle and it's one tile bigger, you need new rewrite rules for that. So recognizing shapes without having lots and lots of rewrite rules can be kind of hard. And that's certainly an open research question. Other problems we were seeing is that it's hard to gain an understanding about your surroundings, mainly because the surroundings may not exist at that point due to where you are in the generation process, or that it's hard to say what is the surrounding and what isn't. That's also the point with influencing surroundings, because when is the player starting to anticipate, and when should you prepare him for the moment you're trying to create? Also creating sufficient variations can be kind of tough, because you need a lot of design knowledge on the game. The implementations you saw earlier, I came up with them, and I would really like to work more with designers to come up with strong implementations, so that they really create those moments of wonder and those other emotions. And then the final limitation was that we did very preliminary evaluation with a few designers in the game industry, and that should be more obviously. And then now this slide, the future work on patterns. The pattern language is by no means done. It only includes a few appraisal patterns and 2 emotion patterns. But using this theoretical basis, we really believe that it can expand much further. So first of all, more patterns should be formulated. Second, and that kind of links back to the problem of the surroundings and influencing those, it should really clearly define what's the surroundings, what's the context, and what should we do with that to make this pattern work. And I suppose that's not clearly enough defined in the pattern language, so that's hard to translate to the grammar. And then finally, new patterns might be required, are required, I would say, especially for expectations and perception, because as I told, everybody can make a different appraisal depending on his or her relationship with the environment. And if you want to ensure that the person will actually make those appraisals, you also have to guide the player and create those expectations and perceptions. So how we could do that, that should be different design patterns in our language. And finally, pacing patterns. Since we're not only trying to create a really happy moment or a really sad moment, we want to create a rich journey experience. So how do we pace between different emotion patterns and make it a really good experience? So I barely talked about related work, but there is some. I will very briefly list it because I think they did really good work. So there's a bit more about appraisal theory in games, but it's mainly about understanding and not generating new content with it. There's more on generating with an emotional goal, and we see that our work has very similar goals, but we have a different approach since we use appraisal theory. And also there are lots of more papers on design patterns in games, and a bit more about tools for mixed initiative, because our work ultimately tries to allow that you can actually direct the generator. So it has a mixed initiative thing to it. And of course, the co-creation, which we heard earlier. So concluding, well, we contributed by proposing a framework for capturing design intent. We did this through a pattern language with design patterns that affect emotions. It's based on a theoretical foundation, so that it's easily to expand. And as a proof of concept, wonder and multiple appraisal patterns have been implemented in the sequel to Explored. And additionally, we propose future work and open research questions, focusing on the surrounding and context of patterns and managing expectations, perception, and pacing. So here are a few acknowledgements. So thanks to Project Like Game Design, and this is the game team in which I also work. We're working on the sequel to Explored, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you very much for all your attention. Any questions? Yes?
Thank you for the talk. That was really interesting.
Oh, thank you.
You've got kind of a difficult problem here because appraisal theory is usually described in terms of appraisals of events in time, and you're trying to apply it sort of to positions in space.
Yeah.
And so that's going to make certain appraisal dimensions easier to think about, like novelty, and other ones you know, having to do with goal interference and things like that harder to think about. Have you thought about trying to do this in some sort of way that would let you reason a little more in terms of time and like how the player would be moving through the space and like what the context of their entering a location in the level would be?
We certainly talked about it because we noticed the problem that certain appraisals are way harder to capture in abstract design patterns in that manner. I would like to talk more with you about it, but we don't have solutions to it yet. Yes?
I mean, I would also like to say very nice first talk. It's a really interesting project. I wonder, as I had a couple of points of sort of have you considered. One of them is, have you considered applying architectural theory to sort of how, you know, the spaces can be intentionally designed to evoke certain things, like, you know, in architecture, there's a lot of theory having to do with sort of how constricted the space feels, and if you have a narrow kind of constricted space followed by one that opens up into big, and that contrast sort of creates a feeling out of the map on the laser. I think that these sort of principles are used for designing things like cathedrals and entrances to buildings that make them feel very grand. Things like that. So,
yeah, we started on formulating some of those patterns, but this has been my bachelor project, so I had a hard deadline. Sadly, we didn't.
Yeah. I certainly understand that we can incorporate every possible theory in the world into possible direction going forward. And
that would be.
Yeah, the other thing was that I wondered, and I don't know about any existing kind of theory around this, but part of wonder to me, and I like that, you know, I like the way you characterize it as sort of novelty and pleasantness without some kind of sense of urgency. But there's also, I feel like, something in it that has to do with when you're feeling wonder, it's like you're also feeling curious about something, right? You feel like you want to linger there for some reason, or maybe study something more closely. And so I wondered, like, do you have any thoughts about how you might capture that aspect of wonder, not just like, oh, there's lots of shiny points in here, so we're gonna run around and get them and then leave, but like, what's actually interesting here that would make the player want to stay and pause and take one of these restful moments in games that I think we don't often think about very much.
That's what we tried, but as you saw on the table earlier, a few emotions have been defined by appraisal theorists, so people that actually know a lot about these appraisals, and we felt like we want to do wonder too. And the way we did that was by talking to a lot of coworkers, other people involved, and we had hours and hours of discussions with what appraisals should be included and what shouldn't. That certainly should be more research kind of. So I'm not sure if our definition of wonder is perfect. If you have any ideas about how it should be, I'd love to talk about it. Yeah?
So the work is pretty interesting. I'm not sure whether I understand correctly. Let's say, can this framework be used to incorporate a certain emotion to the stage? Let's say I'm a game designer. I want the stage to be funny. Is it possible to use this framework to do that?
Currently, no, but that's the goal. Yes. But funny currently isn't included in the pattern language. I guess that should be possible. Yeah.
Thanks.
I guess the framework is ready, but we need to fill in more emotions. So talk to us in a year.
All right, let's just have one more question, and if the final speakers are for the session are ready to start setting up, they should do so.
All right.
Are they here?
I think did we find them?
No.
I don't think so. Oh, well then, I guess we have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah.
Withstand the gauntlet.
Stay there for as long as you want.
Yeah.
I'm okay.
So I was very interested in appraisal theory for spaces in the middle. And one of the things I came across, and I don't know whether you have already looked at it, was the way theme parks use appraisal theory for emotions by actually following concepts and constructs that they learned from film. So, as like an example, with the Haunted Mansion in the Disney theme park, it goes from happiness and Fantasyland, and then it gets darker and darker, but in like a funny, happy way. So the gravestones talk and tells jokes and so on, and look at you, and it's kind of more like a funny horror. But then it gets a little darker, but not too dark. And then again, they know they have to bring their audience out of that area back into like a happy, sunny environment because right next door is Peter Pan, and so it kind of again the way that the architecture changes, so what they show, the lighting and so on, those are all things that they've taken from film and like videos and theory from there and kind of applied it to architecture. So I was wondering whether that might be something that
I found something about theme parks, but I didn't know this yet. Sounds really interesting.
yeah, I have like a nice deep analysis of haunted house if you ever want to come find me. It's definitely my favorite one there.
Yes?
Kind of follow up to that. Do you have a sense of, you've talked a lot about like patterns in isolation. Do you have a sense of how they would work, like following one emotion with another emotion, or how they would like connect together yet?
Well, I propose that for future work. Those would be kind of
Yeah.
basic patterns and how those emotions should
Yeah.
supplement each other and kind of be in the same level or space or
Mm-hmm.
I don't have much ideas
Yeah.
about it yet.
That's what I figured. But
Yes?
I may have missed it, so I apologize if I did, but are you looking for emotions just in the spatial makeup of the setting, or are you also looking at the emotions that a player would get based on the color of objects, the shape of objects, and so forth within the level?
I didn't talk about that. It is in our paper, but I'll answer it. We started by what can we do with only structure and positioning, and it wasn't too long before we noticed that you need other things too, like appearances of objects and what objects you use. So yes, we are including those elements now too.
Are you looking at maybe the juxtaposition between objects that have one emotion and a space that has a different emotion?
Sorry?
So, for example, if we're looking at a big open space of wonder, but you fill it with lots of bright red pointy things that would probably give the player feelings of more angst or anger, something like that. Do you have any plans of looking at how you can kind of mix and match emotions, or if there's any play on how
I didn't even think about that yet, but that sounds really cool, how different emotions can be used together, right?
Yeah, I'm just coming at this from somebody who's looked at evoking emotion in PCG, not from levels, but from art. That's just kind of the way I think about it, is that colors are definitely one thing that people really, they have strong responses to.
Yeah.
And space is another one, and you can have two completely different makeups of the space and of the color that would be opposite ends of the spectrum for emotion. And I feel like that could potentially confound any kind of maybe user studies or anything you do in the future if you don't pay attention to exactly what you're filling your space with.
Sounds really interesting. I didn't work on that yet.
At least we focus on trying to affect one emotion to start with. When we have that under control, then we should consider combination.
So, thank you.
All right, so at this point, we're gonna go to break. We'll be starting up again at the top of the hour at 3 local time for those who are on the stream. And yeah, All right, let's get this ball going. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Anwar Safar. Thanks for coming. For my first presentation, I'll be talking about procedural placement of coins and levels of a platformer game using a method that utilizes trajectories of players moving through the levels, which is what the term desired path sort of alludes to, and also talk about the effect that this has on player behavior compared to other placement strategies. So, what was the motivation behind this work? Well, there are many games that have levels that feature collectibles such as coins, bonuses, and power-ups, and these serve many different purposes in the game. They can give you extra life or boost some ability. But oftentimes collecting these items is a secondary objective, either related or unrelated to a primary objective, such as completing the level or killing the boss character. And so, since collecting such items is a secondary objective, automating their placement could save the designer time in authoring the primary goal to the primary objective of the level. So the idea would be that the designer hand authors a level and then uses some sort of a procedural or automated method to place the collectibles in the game. However, previous work by Anderson has shown that placing such items within levels may decrease player engagement if the placing is not done in a manner that serves the primary objective of the levels. Which is to say that to be effective and not cause any side effects detrimental to the player experience, these placement algorithms should take into account the main goal of the level. So in this example taken from the paper, the coins along the blue path connect the start and the end locations of the level and sort of reinforces the primary goal of completing the level. Whereas the other coins don't. And what Anderson and his team found was that these off-path coins tend to decrease player engagement and negatively impact the player experience. So that brings us to desired paths. So what are desired paths? So in nature, desired paths is a term that is used to refer to paths that are created organically by the footfall of people where they naturally tend to walk, as opposed to paths that are created via construction. And so these paths usually represent a shortcut or a less roundabout way of getting to places than a constructed walkway. And so we sort of borrow this term for platforms to refer to paths within the levels that players are more likely to traverse because they're simple, natural routes from the start to the goal. And so placing collectibles along these desired paths within the platformers may help circumvent some of the issues we talked about in the previous slide. And so that's why we extracted sort of these desired paths for levels in a platformer, placed coins along these paths, and then compared the effect that had on player behavior with other placement strategies. So the game that we used was this really super basic platformer that we implemented in Unity called AIIDE and Train Runner. Consisted of 14 levels spanning various layouts, with each level having multiple paths from start to finish. The goal was to reach the treasure chest at the end of each level that you can see in the bottom right image. There were several hazards that could kill the player. The player had unlimited number of lives, so the only way that the player can actually lose is literally stopping playing the game. And each level had 10 collectible coins, which the player collected by just touching them, but the coins did not have any effect on the actual gameplay. So before talking about the actual path-based placement algorithm, I'll just go over the heuristics that we use. So the main heuristic was that the coin should be on a single path, which is the desired path that we would extract from the player trajectories. Additionally, we also wanted the coins to be well distributed throughout the level so that the players could always have coins to collect as they're moving along the path and not just have coins be in a specific portion of the level. And we also wanted the coins to be clustered near curves and arcs, much like Mario. And also it's worth mentioning that these are just some heuristics that we decided on, and we could use various other heuristics to perform the placement. Okay, so onto the algorithm. The inputs to the algorithm were the number of coins to place, which is 10 for each level, the grid cell definition for each level, the coordinates of the starting and ending locations, and the trajectories of the players who won the level. So in step one, we assign a weight to each cell based on the proportion of winning trajectories that pass through the level. So higher the weight that is assigned, the more number of winning trajectories pass through that cell. In step two, we run an A-star search to find the lowest cost path. The cost is given by the equation on the slide, and what this basically says is that the higher the weight that is assigned to the cell, the lower will be the cost, because we want to prioritize the cells through which more winning trajectories pass through. Once we find the A-star path, we then place the required number of coins evenly along the path. So this step is basically just finding the curvy, curl or the arc-like parts in the path in service to one of the heuristics that I talked about. So this just assigns a high priority value to the parts of the path that are more curved or more arc-like. And then in this step, we just push each coin one step at a time towards the curve-like parts that we identified in the previous slide. And once we do that, we have our final list of coins, and we just output that as the final set of the algorithm. Okay, so that brings us to the actual study. We recruited players using Amazon Mechanical Turk. We performed two human intelligence tests, or HITs, as they're called. The first was to just gather the trajectories of players moving through the levels. And the second one was to perform our actual coin placement evaluation. So for the player trajectories hit, we had 200 participants, out of which 160 completed the hit. There were no coins in this version of the game. There was an introductory level seen for everyone. The order for the remaining levels were randomized, and this hit was just used to gather the trajectories of players moving through the level and not used to perform any sort of evaluation. So that brings us to the second hit that we performed, which is for actually evaluating the paths. So this was a much larger hit. We recruited 1,600 participants. The levels were now served, instead of random order, they were served in order of decreasing player success rate, so that there was a rough difficulty progression to the levels. And the players were randomly assigned into one of the following four conditions. So we had none, where there were no coins in the game. We had path, where the coins were placed using the path-based placement algorithm that I talked about. There was a design condition where we had the coins be placed manually by a game designer who was working with our group, and we just asked the designer to place the coins wherever he wanted, as long as they were reachable by the players. And finally, we had a random condition where the coins were placed randomly in any cell that had at least one winning trajectory path through it. So these were the evaluation measures that we used. Pretty self-explanatory. Finish rate is just the percentage of players in each condition that completed all 14 levels of the game. Okay, so onto the results. So the measures in bold were the ones we observed significant differences across conditions. So in terms of total time spent playing and percentage of players completing the game, those were the only two measures for which we did not find any significant differences. But upon performing pairwise comparisons, we noticed sort of this rough grouping of players into two different categories. So we observed that the players in the no coin or none and the path condition seemed to perform somewhat similar to each other, and the players that design and ran seemed to perform or exhibit behavior similar to each other. In addition to that, we also found pairwise similarities between path and design in terms of levels 1, and between pairings of ran, path, and none per level time, which means that the design condition outperformed all the others in terms of average time spent playing each level. So sort of the takeaways from this was that the players collected more coins in the path condition than in design and run. This sort of makes sense because to collect coins in the path condition, the players simply have to follow the desired path, which by definition is the natural path from the start to the finish. So players should collect coins while making progress towards the primary goal of the level. Whereas in design and run, they had to backtrack, they had to take multiple paths to collect the coins, and so that's why they may have collected lesser number of coins than in paths. Also, players spent most time playing each level in the design condition. Again, design required the players to take multiple paths instead of just a single path. And although that was also true for RAM condition, we think that because design was not random, it was placed in places that were thought meaningful by the designer, that may have helped, or that may have caused the players to play for longer than in the random condition. Going back to Anderson's work, similar to them, we found that the players in the no coins and the path-based condition did not perform or did not exhibit behavior that was significantly different. But a difference we did notice was that while they saw an upward trend for time spent playing with the on-path coins, we saw a downward trend for both time played and levels 1. And this is an interesting thing to note, but if you look at this survival plot, which basically just shows the percentage of players that keep playing as the number of levels goes up, and the top blue line represents the no coins condition, and the red line represents the path condition. You can see that as the number of levels goes up, path seems to start catching up to none. And we think that this possibly means that our levels were probably not hard enough, and that it's only when the levels get harder does having a path of coins to guide the players actually become helpful. It may have been the case that the easy levels were so easy that the players did not benefit from having a guide or a path of coins to guide their ranging strategy. Yeah, so that's essentially what I just said. And the implication is that the path of coins helps players only if the levels are of a sufficient difficulty. So, so to conclude, we found that absent of other utilities, collectibles do not necessarily incentivize players to complete more levels or play for longer, even while they're serving the primary objective of the game, especially if the levels aren't challenging enough to begin with. And so sort of following on from that, we think that collectibles might help only for sufficiently difficult levels. And this is kind of an obvious point that the placement strategy depends upon the designer goals, but I think it's kind of nice to think about what the exact implications are. So if you use sort of a path-based approach, players seem to complete levels more quickly, and using a designer-based approach, players seem to complete a similar number of levels while exploring more and spending more time. So just to finish with some limitations in future work, we only examine one game in a specific genre, so it might be interesting to explore other games and genres. We explored a very narrow design space of just 10 coins, with the coins having no effect, so it'd be interesting to see the effects that would have if the coins would actually impact the gameplay or mechanics in some way. We did not look at the subjective experience of players, which would be nice to do in future work, and of course, like as I already alluded to in the previous slides, there are various other heuristics that you could look at. Okay, so yeah, that brings us to the end. I'd like to thank Liam Procedural for helping out with the designer coin placement, and thanks.
So thanks for this talk. I think it's really cool that you're using this idea, which comes from urban design, to explore game design. I have a question, and I think this might be helpful. But I can see the slide again where you have the images of the levels with the projections of the different paths the players took sort of before you did placement. Yeah, like this one. So so there's this saying, and so designer paths in urban spaces, are useful because usually for urban environments, we want to help people get from point A to B fastest. In games, we don't necessarily want that. We want, of course, it's more like a journey to better than the destination. And so, what I see here is actually really interesting because it seems like there are two different paths. One of them is preferred in a way. There's also parts where they can kind of cross over, and if you decide to go up, you can sort of defect and move down sometimes. But what you're doing by kind of recognizing the top path as the desired path is you're kind of eliminating this choice. You're kind of saying, actually, let's put coins on the one that is most commonly troubled. And just sort of, and now it kind of makes the bottom option even less appealing than maybe it was to begin with. Have you thought about maybe flipping that on its head and say like,
So,
instead of
so like I said, there's free heuristics we could use, or we could, so we could definitely consider using multiple paths. Then kind of depends on what we're going for. So this was just like a preliminary, so to see like what effect we would placing it on sort of the most desired path would have. But yes, certainly.
Do you have further thoughts about what would maybe you use this to deliberately introduce interesting trade-offs when the player is making decisions?
Right. Yeah, so you can certainly affect the difficulty of the levels. So you can say like sort of the least desired path and place points along those to sort of affect how the player can traverse the levels. But yeah, I think there's like an interesting design where you could just choose which how desired of a path you would want to place the points on.
Maybe to create more exploration.
Sure.
Not even necessarily to be that difficulty, but just in sort of asking the player to appreciate the level of it.
Which is what the designer thing kind of helps do, because it forces the players to explore more, whereas the path just tells you to go from A to B as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I sort of want to just like sort of continue on. It's I guess maybe less a question and more just a conversation. But like I think something that's interesting that in like Mario or something, right? Often like coins will be like in the early levels, coins will be like placed of like, and here's sort of the path that you should take, and then like eventually that starts to be like subverted and stuff. And so I think like being able to play with that and like maybe in early stages favoring the like obvious paths and then like using it to highlight other paths that maybe have something else or something would definitely be interesting.
So you brought up, and this is kind of leapfrogging off of their comments as well, and you also brought up the notion of these levels were kind of easy.
Yeah.
And this is just me speaking anecdotally, I don't, if I'm playing a particularly difficult platformer, I'm not using the coins to, like, that's not how I beat the level. I beat the level mostly by dying a whole lot, and then slowly getting better, which I assume is, if this game was sufficiently difficult, is what people would do as well. So you talk about it as like the coins are there to highlight a path, but that might not necessarily be the case if like players in the non-path figured it out as well. I hate to say this is more of a comment than a question. I don't really know what I'm saying, but it seems like you brought up difficulty. Have you thought about exploring the notion of difficulty and whether or not coins or any kind of reward might make a difference there?
Yeah, so we definitely have thought about increasing the difficulty of the game overall, because of sort of what I mentioned at the end, was the path just seems to have an effect as the levels get harder. But yeah, that's certainly
Yeah, I'm just curious about if you gathered any data from the players other than just their path through the level and how long they played.
not for this.
This is again not a question, this is more like a general statement, but I actually think it might be interesting to see what the players were intending to do. Maybe if you do like a post-questioning.
Yeah, that was a limitation. We didn't have any
Right.
subjective
Because
questions.
again, like going back to what you were saying, if they wanted to just like complete the level and not die, they might have a completely different goal in their mind than taking coins. Like I might not really be coin motivated in general for the game. So.
I just want to plug a little thing in there for that exact topic. Because you're talking about something that like is a pretty known phenomenon in games, and there's archetypes of players. And so I would suggest that people go and look at procedural personas, which generate dungeon levels based on this goal-driven idea where some are coin collectors, some are monster hunters, some are speedrunners, and so forth. Those different goals have a big effect on how people go through a level and the trajectories that you can see.
I was intrigued by the analogy you make with the desire paths in nature, because there it seems that the desire paths are actually not the paths intended by the architect, for example. Yes, and here I'm wondering if you're the architect with specific intentions, or and
So the first experiment that we ran, that had no coins in it, so we just tracked where the players were moving naturally in order to win the levels. So those were the desired paths. so there was no help to indicate to the players where to move.
Yeah, so the analogy here is that sometimes people will construct an outdoor space by kind of placing, just very minimal footpaths along the ground, waiting to see where people create desired paths, and then they'll go back and paint over it. So I view this as very analogous, right? They're kind of trying to see what the natural paths are, and then going and painting like points.
All right.
Just wondering, I mean, is this that players incentivized for collecting coins in your stage? Did you tell them the experiment that you should, collect as many coins as possible?
Yeah.
Well,
but we told them that it does not affect the game, so it's just up to the players whether they want.
Oh, so it's not that they are asking to collect every single coins in the stage. Oh, okay, got it.
It's completely up to the players what they want. We just told them to make progress throughout the game by reaching the treasure chest.
Okay, I was thinking that will affect the coin count for an experiment because they're not incentivized to do that anyways.
Yeah, so that's definitely some future way that we could do is give the players an incentive to actually collect the coins, apart from just collecting it for collection's sake.
All right, thank you.
Whenever.
Okay, so in this presentation, I'll be talking about some work. It actually started out as a project for a machine learning class, in which we generated levels that were blends of levels from two different games, using LSTMs that were trained on original levels from these games. And in somewhat the spirit of EXAG, this is even though it doesn't say so in the title, this is very much towards the results are super preliminary, but I think they're still interesting to talk about. So what was the motivation behind this work? Well, there's been a lot of work recently in applying ML techniques to generate content using trained models. And just as two examples that are most related to this work, we have the work of Somerville and Matthias in generating Mario levels by sequence prediction using LSTMs. And also work by Gazelle and Riddell, where they use the notion of conceptual blending with probabilistic graphical models to generate new Mario levels by blending existing ones. And relatedly, Gao and Cornelli proposed a framework in the VGDL, or the video game description language, for generating new games, not just by blending levels of a game, but by blending games in their entirety. And so what they did was they took the VGDL specification for Frogger, combined it with that of Zelda, and came up with Frogger, where the character has to cross this the part in the middle, like in Frogger, and grab the key and open the lock down there, like in Zelda. And this is interesting. We sort of wanted to combine these two notions. So we wanted to see whether we could leverage PCGML techniques to perform this kind of game blending. And so instead of manually constructing this type of game, could we use trained models to automate this sort of game blending process? And so that's kind of what we did. So we trained LSTMs on existing levels of Mario and Kid Icarus, then sampled from the trained models to generate new ones that contain properties and characteristics of both games. So essentially creating a level generator for this third game that's kind of a mixture of Mario and Icarus. And we also parameterized the generators so that you can use weights to control sort of the approximate amount of each game in the final blend. And so we're mentioning in the interest of time, I'll describe things at a super high level. not go into too much technical detail. If you want to sort of read up on that, I urge you to read the paper. So the data set that we used was the video game level corpus, which had 15 levels of Mario and 6 levels of Icarus, with Mario levels going from left to right and Icarus levels going from bottom to top. And in the corpus, the levels are represented using text files of each character mapping to a specific tile, as shown in the images. Which brings us to blending. So conceptual blending is this theory that novel concepts can be produced by combining elements of existing concepts, and it has this four-space theory, which talks about two input spaces, which constitute the concepts prior to being combined. There's a generic space into which the input concepts are projected into define points of commonality and equivalence. And once you do that, there's this blend space into which you project these equivalent or common points and evolve or generate new concepts. So for us, the input spaces were the original level corpus from Mario and Kid Icarus from the VGLC with these mappings. And for the generic space, we mapped sort of the semantically common elements to a uniform representation while trying to preserve as many unique elements as possible. So on the left-hand side, you see the original tiles, and the right is the tiles we used in our generic mapping. We used a very conservative approach. The only common elements that we identified were background character, solid ground, enemy, and yeah, that's about it. And we just converted the Icarus representation of the solid ground and the hazards into the Mario ones. And you could do various other mappings. You could, for example, map a pipe in Mario to a door in Icarus, and then the final generalized levels would have just one of those two representations. So to perform the training, we used LSTMs. For this purpose, the way it works is that it learns a probability distribution for the next item in the sequence, given the sequence so far, and then during the generation process, it uses this learned probability distribution to predict the next character in the sequence. And the reason we sort of use this was that there's been past work in generating Mario levels, so there was a lot of freely available code that I could mess around with and not have to write anything from scratch. So shout out to Adam Somerville for making all of that available. Yeah, so in order to train these LSTMs, you need to represent the levels as sequences. So each level is a collection of sequences, with each tile being a point in a sequence. And in Mario, we feed in sequences of columns, and in Kid Icarus, we feed in sequences of rows. And you need to induce the appropriate ordering so that the LSTMs learn the sense of progression of the levels. So in Mario, we feed in sequences from left to right, and in Icarus, we feed in rows from bottom to top. And we sort of standardize the length of the sequences. So the LSTM is trained on sequences of 16 character Mario columns and 16 character Icarus rows. This is a very high level overview of the training process. So we have the original level from the corpus. We apply the generic mapping to generalize these levels into a common representation, and then we trained 3 different LSTMs. So we had a combined LSTM generator, which was trained on both Mario and Icarus levels. We had a Mario-only generator, which was only trained on the Mario levels, and similarly, we had an Icarus-only generator. But since SMB and KI levels differ in orientation, an issue in generating levels was determining whether a generated sequence should be laid out as a column or a row. And so we essentially needed to answer the question, should a generated sequence be laid out like a Mario column or Icarus row? And to do that, we trained a classifier on the training corpus in order to determine if a generated sequence was more Mario-like or more Icarus-like. Moving on to the generation process. So the way this works is you forward an initial level seed to the LSTM repeatedly, which keeps predicting the next most likely character, and you keep repeating that until the entire level string has been generated. So just to depict this visually, suppose you have this much of the level generated so far. The LSTM predicts that the tile in the red square as the next, as the most likely next character. That character is generated, and then that keeps repeating until you have the full level. Using the models, we defined 3 different flavors of generators. So we had an unweighted generator that used the model trained on the combined data set. We had one weighted generator that used the model that used the same combined model, and we had another weighted generator that used the models that were trained separately. So this generator was composed of Mario only subgenerator and an Icarus only subgenerator. And for the unweighted generator, we created levels consisting of 200 sequences. And for weighted generators, we generate levels in segments, and so we had 10 segments of 20 sequences each. Just quickly going through how each of the generators work. So the unweighted generator, you feed in the starting seed, which can be either a segment of Mario or a segment of Icarus. You then run it through the combined LSTM generator, gives you a sequence. You run the classifier on that sequence. The classifier tells you whether it's more like Mario or more like KI or Kid Icarus. And once enough sequences have been generated, you either stop or repeat for the next level. For the weighted generator, the one that uses the combined model, now have this notion of a Mario weight and an Icarus weight. And the way this works is that suppose Mario weight is 0.4 and the Icarus weight is 0.6. That says that the level that is to be generated is about 40% Mario and 60% Icarus. So using the weight, and I should mention the generation using the weighted generator proceeds in segments of Mario and Icarus. So using the weight, you determine if you want the next segment to be, or if the next segment should be Mario or Icarus. You then kind of repeat the same process from the last generator. Combined generator gives you a sequence, you run the classifier. The classifier tells you if that's a Mario or Icarus, if that's the correct sequence, which was determined prior to the generation started. You then move on to generating the next sequence. If it's not, you regenerate the same sequence again. And you repeat that until the entire segment has been generated, and you keep generating segments until the whole level has been completed. And finally, using the weighted generator that uses the separate subgenerators, again, you start with the weights, you determine if the next segment is Mario or Icarus. This time, you're guaranteed to get either a Mario or an Icarus sequence, so you don't have to use the classifier. And again, similarly, once you generate enough sequences for the segment, you repeat it for the next segment, and once you have enough segments, you're done for the level. So that moves to the layout. So we use this super basic layout algorithm. There are 3 cases, so you can have either a column after a column or a row after a row. In that case, you can simply just stack one after another. If you get a row after a column, what we did was we aligned the row with the y coordinate of the topmost point of the column on which the pair can stand. And similarly, if we got a column after a row, we aligned the topmost point of the column on which the pair can stand with the row. And this was done so that the players could keep moving from rows to columns and columns to rows. But yeah, the layout function was separate from generation. So the idea is the generator spits out a bunch of sequences, and then you can lay them out using whatever layout function. So these are just some example levels that were generated. Yeah, that's not much to say about that. And these were generated using the weighted generator. Yeah.
Sorry, where's the player start in?
So
It's almost the bottom left of the first one, but is that also the case?
Yeah. And yeah, just to give you a sense of the weighted generation affecting the levels. So this is more and more Mario and less Icarus as you go through the units. Okay, so we wanted to use some sort of some measures that value the levels, so just staring at them. So we used leniency, which was to capture a sense of how difficult a level is just by using the enemy sprites and the number of gaps. Density, which gives a measure of how much of the level the player can occupy or stand on. So we also have these related measures of sequence density, sequence variation, which kind of compares the generated levels with the training set, or how different it is. So higher the values for these, the more similar to the training set the generated levels are. And we had a very simple aspect ratio just to look at the height by the width of the levels. So we computed those measures for the training set, for both the Mario and the Icarus training set, and different pairs of weights. So on the left of the x-axis, you have the Mario training set. On the right, we have the Icarus, and the weights are varying from being more Mario to more Icarus. So as you can see, at least based on these measures, the levels do seem to roughly interpolate between Mario and Icarus. And just comparing the two different types of weighted generators, the generator that was trained on the separate sort of the Mario, that used the Mario only and the Icarus only generator, that adheres more closely to the training set. Whereas the one that was using the combined data set, that led to more novel sequences being generated. In terms of leniency and density, this was, again, we were able to roughly interpolate between the two. There are points where the generated levels become sort of go out of the range. And this is explained by the fact that the Icarus training set had only 6 levels, and one of the levels was actually a major outlier in terms of these two values. So we have this weird case where some of the generated levels, at least in terms of leniency and density, were more Icarus than the actual Icarus levels. All right, so just wrapping up, altering weights like this didn't seem to impact the type of levels that were generated, and you could roughly sort of interpolate between Mario and Icarus. And there's also just that by using this methodology, you can generate levels that are mixed of levels from the two games, but can also be made to be more like one than the other by varying the weights. And some of the deviations that we look at suggest that these methods can also produce some amount of novelty that makes the generated levels different from the levels that we use for training. So some future work and limitations. So an obvious limitation is that we didn't run any playability tests or used any playability or path-based information while training, and so the levels are mostly not really playable and certainly not completable. But you could use an agent to sort of carve out a path post-generation or encode some of the sense of path information into the training corpus to overcome these issues. But having said that, you would expect this to be the case if you're blending levels from different games. You wouldn't expect Mario only or Icarus only mechanics to give you a playable game when you're using blended levels. And so some future work could look at how you could blend the mechanics of the two games in order to be able to play through the levels that are generated with this. Another thing that could be done is you give a blended level to an evolutionary algorithm and have that algorithm evolve mechanics that make sense for the blended levels. Yeah, so that's all I have. Thanks for sticking around and listening. Yes.
When you generated the levels, did you get a lot of noise at times?
Yes.
For the generation? Yep. And so how did you get over that difficulty?
So what exactly do you mean when you say noise?
Well, did you get a lot of just random pieces out in the middle of nowhere where, like you say, you couldn't be able to complete or play the levels, but did the levels actually look like they looked like a level, or were they just random bits of stuff all over?
We did have situations where there were completely disconnected components. We didn't have noise to that.
Okay. I guess, again, sorry, more comment than question. I think an interesting thing, as opposed to training the classifier like separately would be to like include that as like part of the thing that is being like right in the autoregressive process of predicting the next thing, like predict like which sequence should be generated next or something would be, I think, an interesting approach.
Yeah.
And I had something else, but I forgot it, so we'll talk later.
Are you about to play?
They're not super playable yet. Once they're more playable, I'll let you know. Yes.
So did you think of, I mean, blending more, let's say, games from a different genre? I mean, I know that.
That's certainly future work that I'm interested in, but I have not.
Okay.
Are you considering automated methods to make your levels playable, or do you think adding more constraints in the generation process would do the trick?
I'm kind of interested in trying out all three of these approaches, so yes.
I will say from my experience, the encoding the path information is very strong. Like that, in having it so that it must generate an exemplar path as it's going, can go from like a 50% playability with just trained on level geometry up to like 98% playability without any sort of post hoc like needing to like repair or fix a level.
I want to kind of try to rephrase my question. Once you get the levels in the state where they are technically playable, what do you think is going to be fun about this idea? I mean, I think it is a fun idea, but what are you anticipating being a cool outcome?
I mean, I just want to see what it's supposed to
Yeah.
Yeah.
A silly one. Why fold and not self-care?
Use it as go in front. All right, thank you.
And with that, I think that concludes EXAG.
Yeah, that's a wrap. What's that?
Interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Vegetable class.
So I'm about to tweet this out, but I just also wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here, both in person, online. Thank you to everyone who submitted papers. Thank you to all of the people who helped out, both with the volunteering and AIIDE as a whole, and the entire program committee who did all of the paper reviews. And events like this are always really magical to me, but it takes so much time and effort from so many people, and I just want to say thank you to everyone.
Yeah. Joe did a lot of the heavy lifting. So Joe, Alex, and I organized this. Alex couldn't be here. So let's thank Joe for doing the stream and the social media. This is really exciting. I know for a lot of you folks as well, those of you who are returning or those of you for whom this is your first event ever, EXAG is kind of the best. Like, AIIDE is really cool, but EXAG is kind of the coolest. So this is something that's there are multiple exits, sir. No. So this is something that's compelling to you. If you'd like to help out, you can talk to me, you can talk to Joe. We'd love to have you. But anyway, we did another one, and it was awesome. These talks were really great. So thank you all so very much.